This learning module is about geography in Japan, both ancient Japan, classical Japan, and modern Japan. So let's start with early Japan, and a lot of the scans that you're going to see on your screen are found in the Princeton Companion in the section that you were to have read for today's lesson, so you can sort of follow along there. First, I'll point out that I'm not going to cover all of classical Japanese geography. I'm just going to look at sort of one point in history, and that is sort of the more classical era that carries on all the way into the Tokugawa. And traditionally, Japanese geography doesn't include Hokkaido. Hokkaido doesn't get included in the country until the Meiji period, so we're not really going to look at Hokkaido. Traditionally, there were what they call district divisions, and the kanji that is used for indicating that is this one, the michi or do. Okay. And then there are also regions, chiho. We're going to take a look at that. So in pre-modern Japan, the country was traditionally divided into 8 district divisions. And one of the things that's a little confusing about the Princeton Companion map is that Miner lists Hawaii down here kind of separately, and then doesn't list it in his annotation. Traditionally, that part of the country kind of gets encompassed within the Kinai district. And also, you'll see in some subsequent slides that the Kinai or central district sort of stands apart from the rest of them. It doesn't have that suffix of do, okay? And so sometimes you'll see references to the 7 districts, the 7 do, and sometimes people refer to it as 8 because they're including central Japan. So here they are, all 8 of them. There is the Tosan-do at the top, Hokurikudo, Tokaido, say more about that in a minute, Sanyō-do, or sorry, San-in-do, Sanyō-do, Nankaido, and Saikaido. Okay. And one of the things first that I'd like to kind of point out about these in geographical terms is that a lot of these divisions are long and skinny. They're not smaller chunks. I mean, in central Japan, the Kinai is a smaller, more roundish geographical area. And I suppose you could argue that Shikoku and Kyushu are too. But when you look at those divisions on Honshu, you notice that they're long and skinny. And that's because they're really delineating major roads, major paths in the country that go all the way back to the Heian period. There wasn't a tremendous amount of travel happening in the Heian period. It was very difficult to do, and Japan is very mountainous, and there was no tourist industry or anything like that. But over time, standard routes certainly were developed. And so when we look at these traditional divisions, we think of them often, as you'll see in subsequent slides, in terms of the road that they encompassed. So this is Miner's version of the map. Let's look at a Japanese breakdown. This is from a classical Japanese dictionary that I have. And this one doesn't give us central Japan. It doesn't cover the capital, but it does cover all of the other districts. And what this particular one does, first you notice that it says 7 here, not 8, because it's not including the center of Japan. But it tells you what each of the provinces within those divisions, what they were. And it gives you the reading of each one. I'm going to be saying more about provinces as we move forward today. But before I get there, let me return to this idea of roads. Now, one of those units that we were just looking at, one of those districts or roads, is the Tokaido, which is probably the most famous of them all. You may have heard of the Tokaido. Sometimes it's called the Eastern Sea Route, I think for reasons you can figure out looking at the kanji. And so the Tokaido is not only the name of a district, but it's also the name of a specific route, which you see on your slide here. The route went from the capital of Kyoto along the seacoast to Edo, or modern-day Tokyo. And along the route, on this map, they're marked with little yellow dots, were what we usually translate as barriers. The Japanese character for that is seki. It's kansai no kan. And at each barrier, it was kind of like, think of it as the modern equivalent of a New York State thruway toll booth, except much more complicated. Nowadays, at the toll booth, you kind of drive through really quickly, especially if you have Easy Pass. But in these particular barriers, travelers would normally stop, show their papers. They'd have to have permission to travel. Sometimes there were inspections, sometimes there were fees. And over time, what also happened along these individual stops, barriers along the Tokaido, is that kind of a traveling infrastructure arose. So back in the Heian period, for example, this was still terribly undeveloped, but by the time you get to the Tokugawa period, in part because of the alternate attendance system and a lot of travel between Kyoto or Heian and Edo or Tokyo, what we see is the development of travel amenities such as places you could eat, restaurants, places you could sleep, inns, and all that kind of thing, which back in the Heian were really unheard of. Even in the beginning of the Tokugawa, famous travelers like Matsuo Basho, who admittedly spent a lot of his time traveling kind of out in the sticks and not necessarily on the well-worn path, still found it a little bit hard to find comfortable places to sleep along the road. Okay, in any event, what we see here is the Tokaido and all of its different stages or barriers. There's 53 of them. And this was a route, as I said, that was heavily traveled during the Tokugawa because of the alternate attendance system. And indeed, traveling away from the capital, particularly if you were female and or female with children, was difficult because in the alternate attendance system, of course, the families of the daimyo had to spend half their time in the capital, or sorry, the family spent all their time in the capital, and the daimyo had to travel away half the time and spend half the time in the capital. And so the families were always sort of sitting in Edo as hostages. And if a daimyo wanted to rebel against the Tokugawa shogunate, then he would put his family in danger. So one fear that the Tokugawa shogunate always had was that these families of the daimyo would be leaving the capital, sneaking away. And so eventually traveling along this road became notoriously difficult, particularly for women and or women traveling with children. And so consequently, what happened was, you know how human beings are, they take the path of least resistance. A second route became more popular. This one started and ended in the same place. This is the Nakasendo. This is not named for one of the districts, but it does refer to this route through the mountains from Kyoto to Edo. And it too had stages along the way, but it was reputed to be a little less stringent in its inspections and things like that. So the Tokaido, we'll look at both of them here in comparison. And so you can see how they begin in the same place and they end in the same place, but it's a very different route. These were some of the more highly traveled routes during the Tokugawa period. Okay, so let's focus again on the top one, on the Tokaido, as a representative of those long and skinny districts, if you will. If we look at a map of traditional Japan, and this is a map that comes from one of my classical Japanese dictionaries, one of my Kogo Jiten, it shows us those specific districts. They're broken down by thick brown lines here, okay? And then the label of each is also in brown, in these brown squares. So we can see, again, Hokkaido is not included, and central Japan has its own separate box up here on the map. What I want to do first is I want to focus just on this area up here of the map, a key to what information we find on the map. Let me blow it up so you can see it a little bit better. So this is a map of the old province names, and what it gives us is travel times from each province to the capital. So for example, Noto is the province name, and the number at the top, what you see after the province name is something that looks like a fraction. The number on the top is the number of days, according to the Engi Shiki, a work of classical literature, that it would take to travel to the capital from the provinces. And the number at the bottom of that thing that looks like a fraction is the number of days that it would take to travel from the capital to the provinces. And then the number in the box is the number of days to the capital by the sea route. Now you might be wondering, well, gee, why was it that it took twice as long to go to the capital from the provinces as it did to go from the capital to the provinces? And the answer is that, at least according to the annotation there, that if you were traveling to the capital, you would be burdened with lots of cargo, and therefore it took you a lot longer than it would in the other direction. So really what this map demonstrates to us is the centrality of the capital in traditional Japan. Your distance from it really dictated your connection to the social world. Now I want to kind of leap forward a little bit into the Tokugawa. What we were just looking at was based on the Heian period. And when we enter into the Tokugawa period, we see the establishment of the daimyo system. And there were, sometimes people think, well, the daimyo were, they're translated as provincial lords, and so we think there was one per province. So I just wanted to demonstrate by showing a couple maps of Tokugawa Japan that show you the different distribution of castles, large and small. What you see here on your screen is central Japan. So this is Lake Biwa here, just to give you some perspective of what's sitting where. And you can see there's an awful lot of different castles. By the way, the website from which I got this is interactive, and you can click on the castles and find out information about them, but it's entirely in Japanese, and I thought that might be a little bit overwhelming. But you can certainly find that kind of information. Let's also look at Kyushu just as a sample. So Kyushu doesn't have that many provinces in it traditionally, but it's got a ton of castles all over the place. So the number of daimyo who were traveling on that alternate attendance system was a relatively big number. Okay, so that's very quickly traditional Japan, although we're going to visit it a little bit more for reasons that should become clear. Now I want to talk about modern Japan, modern Japanese geography. There's some tricks to the trade in figuring out some basic geographic data. So keep in mind that in English we use the word province, or in Japanese kuni or shu, to refer to pre-modern geographic entities only. And when we get into modern Japan, instead of using province, we use the word prefecture. And the Japanese term for that is ken. Here's that kanji. In addition to prefectures, there's also a district in modern Japan. It's Hokkaido. Think of it kind of like, there's a district in the United States, a District of Columbia. Well, Hokkaido is technically a district. It's not a prefecture. There's also a municipality. Tokyo is its own entity in that respect, the municipality of Tokyo. And there are two urban prefectures, or fu. There's Kyoto and there's Osaka. And I'm going to be showing you at least a map of Tokyo to give you a better idea of what that municipality covers. But before we get there, let's stay at the macro level. I want to address this concept of chiho. The Japanese term for this is chiho, which is usually translated as a region. And on this map, we see that word chiho here. Okay. And in modern Japan, the country is often divided into similarly area-wise large regions, and so similar to those traditional districts that we were just looking at. But you'll notice that this, when we look at the modern chiho, we're not looking so much at those long, skinny entities. We're looking at more geographically something that looks kind of like a state in the United States. So there are the following regions: the Hokkaido region in the north, Tohoku, Kanto, Chubu, Hokuriku, Kinki, Chugoku, Shikoku, and Kyushu, going north to south. Why is this important to know? Well, Chiho are used in all kinds of divisions. So for example, a weather map, if you want to know what the weather's going to be, you're looking on the internet or you're looking in a newspaper, what have you, usually it will tell you not necessarily what the weather for a prefecture will be, but it will tell you what the weather for a Chiho will be. And so it's really good to become familiar with these Chiho. There aren't that many of them because, okay, right here on the slide, I'm showing you a map of them. But finding those on a map, say like a road atlas or something like that, will be next to impossible. Let me give you an American analogy. In the United States, we talk about New England all the time. And if you grew up in the United States, you know where New England is. Even if you're a little off, maybe you're not sure about Vermont or something like that, but you know New England, you have a general feel in your gut where New England is. But ask your international friends, do you know where New England is? And they might say, well, gee, no, it's not England, is it? You say, no, it's in the United States. And your poor international friends are going to look at a map around McNally Road Atlas or something like that, and they're not going to find New England. New England is nowhere there. It's not even in the index because it's assumed that everybody who's using the map will know where New England is. Likewise, we talk about the Midwest all the time, but that's not intuitive. The Midwest. I think if you didn't know anything about the United States, you'd assume that the Midwest is Colorado. But the Midwest usually is seen to extend from, western Pennsylvania out to the Mississippi and beyond. So these are general terms for very large regions that encompass multiple states that we absolutely take for granted. And these Chiho in Japan are the same kind of thing. So let me show you another map with the Chiho marked, and it's broken down by prefecture, so you can actually see which prefectures fit into which Chiho. You can find maps like this pretty easily all over the internet. All right, so now I want to get down out of the macro level into the smaller level. I'm going to skip over prefectures because we're looking at prefectures right here. You can see there are 47 divisions, including the district, okay? And I want to get into smaller divisions, municipal subdivisions. So here are some terms that are good to become familiar with, and the translations of these really vary. So we have ku, districts, sections of cities, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. We have towns. We have cities. And here's another town, which is a different geopolitical entity. We have townships. These are gun, which tend to be out on the outskirts of a larger urb. And we have villages. Now, despite the kind of pastoral image that you might have in your head when you see the word village, it isn't necessarily a rural place. Indeed, there are large villages, as you'll see in the next map, outside of incorporated within the municipality of Tokyo, and really they're just part of a mega urb, but their geopolitical entity is called a mura, or a village. So as an example, let me show you a map of modern Tokyo. What we see on the far right hand side in the purple is what's usually considered central Tokyo, and the divisions we see there are all ku. Okay? And indeed, if you live in Tokyo and you own a motor vehicle in Tokyo, your license plate won't just say Tokyo, it'll say which ku you live in. And, you know, some ku are swankier than others. Everybody wants a Shinagawa ku license plate because that's where all the rich folks live. So we see this part here, this purple part, is central Tokyo, and then moving out. But this is the whole thing that we see in this map is municipal Tokyo. So that toll that I mentioned earlier, Tokyo toll, is this whole area. And then we get out of the purple and into the orange or the gold. We see shi, individual cities. These are all shi, except for there's a machi right here and here, right? Got a couple machis out to the far west. So cities and townships. And then once we get outside of the townships, we end up, here's a mura, okay? But if we were looking at this on the satellite, like I said, this is not exactly a pastoral area here. It's still relatively populated and probably indistinguishable on a satellite photo of the city. So we have these different geopolitical entities, and why am I mentioning this? Because I want to explain how postal addresses work in Japan. I know that most people don't send things by mail very often, but you do still physically need to find places, and often when you need to find a place, what you have to work with is an address. So I want to explain how to scrutinize a postal address. Postal addresses in Japan begin with the postal code, so it's like our zip code. And initially, postal codes were smaller numbers, like 3-digit numbers. Now they've grown into hyphenated multi-number, depends where you are, codes. So it starts with the postal code, and then one has the city, and then the next smaller division, geopolitical division, whatever that may be, given the context of the place. So for example, I have here an address from Osaka. So it starts with the postal code here. And then we have, it's Osaka Fu, that municipality of Osaka. And within Osaka Fu, it's Osaka Shi, the city of Osaka within the municipality of Osaka. And then the district, Kitaku. Lots of cities have a Kitaku, the northern district. And then the neighborhood within that district is called Nakanoshima. And then we have a number, 3-2-4. What that is not a street number. There is no street name here. Most streets in Japan don't have street names. So we have a smaller division within a larger division within a larger division within a larger division. So once we get down to this neighborhood, Nakanoshima is the name of the neighborhood of this address. And Nakanoshima has divisions. It has at least 3 divisions. The first number that we see here is going to be the number associated with that neighborhood. So we're in Nakanoshima-san. And then within that division of san, there's further divisions, and we're in the second one here. And then ultimately, there'll be a building number. And it's not going to be consecutive numbers like what we see on street numbers in the United States, as you'll see on the map. And the building number is 4. Okay? I'm going to try and make this visually much clearer in a couple more slides. So if it's a little confusing, just hang on and we'll get there. And then I have the company in this case, the building that I'm sending the letter to. This is the Asahi Shimbun building, 5th floor. So that's an example of one address. And before I get to finding that on a map more clearly, I want to briefly focus on how we deal with addresses if you were to send a letter. I think everybody's fairly familiar with this. This is a typical layout for an address for an envelope in the United States. Our stamp goes up in the upper right here, right? The address to whom we're sending things goes here, and the return address goes here. And the order, of course, is the name and the street address, and then the city and state and zip code. But what about Japanese envelopes? Here's 2 examples of ways to address envelopes in Japan. So first of all, they're usually addressed, the envelope is more vertical than it is horizontal. The stamp goes in the upper left-hand corner. You see it's marked here and here. The example on the left is an envelope being sent to an individual, and the example on the right is a letter being sent to a company, somebody at a company. So the red boxes are for the postal code, which is usually 7 digits long. And then we see here the city, Tokyo-to, Shibuya-ku, okay? And then we get the neighborhood, the numbers, these zeros are representing numbers, and then some more zeros representing numbers, such and such a mansion, 501, or maybe these zeros here, these circles represent a name, okay? And then, and that's off to the right-hand side of the envelope. And then in the middle, in larger characters, larger kanji, is the name of the person to whom the letter is being sent, okay? On the right-hand side, we have the address again. We have the name of the company. We have the title of the person to whom the letter is being sent, and then the person's name. Usually the person's name is in kanji that is larger than the rest of the envelope, and the address at the end of the person's name. If they're a professor or doctor or something like that, then you might see sensei instead. But in general, the term that one uses is sama, okay? Not san, but sama. So that's how you would address an envelope were you to send something in the mail. And I know a lot of you don't send stuff in the mail very often, but it's still useful information to have. Okay, so let me talk about electronic resources, because that's really what most folks these days use when they're looking for maps. Although that said, I always recommend to my students who are studying abroad that maybe they're going to get a smartphone when they get there that's going to have GPS in it, and that's great. But another great resource are these little pocket maps that you can buy in any bookstore, in any train station in a big city, that gives you much of the detail that we're going to be looking at electronically today. So you could use those. You could use what we're going to look at, which is Mapion. My other advice is don't ever try and buy maps before you get to Japan. That's usually true anywhere in the world where you're traveling. The local maps are going to be a whole lot better than anything you're going to be able to get stateside. Now you might say, yeah, but if I buy it stateside, I have a better chance of finding it in romanization. You don't want a map in romanization. You actually want one that has kanji. If it's bilingual, that's great. But more often than not, you're going to want something that has the kanji, because if you see a kanji that's a place name, you probably won't know how to read it. And if all you have is romanization, how are you going to put those two things together? So don't mess with that. Just bite the bullet and do your best with Japanese language resources. Okay, so back to electronic resources. Google Maps is a great resource. I got nothing against Google Maps. I use it all the time in the United States. But if you're dealing with Japan, I would argue that it's Google Maps' Japanese cousin, if you will, which is called Mapion, is better. And I have the URL there so you can find it. I want to give you a little quick tour of Mapion, but before I do that, I'm going to tell you why Google Maps is good, but Mapion is better. Here is a map of Kansai Gaidai, actually. Those of you who have studied at Kansai Gaidai may find this very nostalgic. Kansai Gaidai is right in the center here. The campus is right here in the middle. What we see on this map is, okay, I got this map as a screenshot from Mapion, and it might be a little bit daunting because we've got kanji and not romanization. But each one of these names here is a neighborhood name. Here's the name of Kansai Gaidai, Kansai Gai Kokugo Daigaku, okay? It's missing the gaku because this is just an abbreviation. Here we have a major highway. We have those little blue markers with circles are traffic lights. And the detail that we get here is really quite useful. So we have these neighborhood names. So for example, Ueno 3, Ueno 2, Ueno 1. And they are marked on this map by different colors. So if I'm moving from this kind of green area into a blue area, I'm changing neighborhoods. Remember those neighborhoods on the address? That's why this is really important. And then within the neighborhoods, you see these little brown numbers. Those are the smaller subdivisions within the neighborhood. So if you had a postal address, you could use this map to find what you're looking for relatively easily. Now, keep in mind, these streets, they don't have street names. It's not that the map is bad. There really are no big street names here. Okay, let's look at the same map in Google Maps. Wow. Okay, there's one advantage, and that is that we have romanization for the neighborhoods. But gee, where are the numbers? No neighborhood numbers, no color differentiation between those particular neighborhoods. If this was the only map that you had to work with, it would be really hard to find an address. Happily, most cell phones in Japan are now equipped with GPS, and that makes traveling around and finding things a lot easier. Before the advent of smartphones and GPS, even natives would often carry maps with them. This is why it's so easy to buy very detailed, very useful pocket maps in Japan, because even if you lived in that city your whole life, you would still need that. Let me point out one more thing on that previous map. You see how the numbers aren't really in any logical way put together? So, you've got 2 right next to 39, and 7 and 3 right next to each other. And if you look at each one of these neighborhoods, you see that there isn't a particular rhyme or reason to how the numbers are put together. Often there's some sequence, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, but then, 17 is over here. You got to kind of leap around to find it. And then 18's here, and then 19 is here. You just got to go all over the place to find the numbers. I mean, reminds me a little bit of some of the complicated dot to dots that my son does. You're doing fine, you're going 1, 2, 3, 4, and then suddenly you just can't figure out where that next dot is. This is because the numbers are often assigned as a neighborhood develops. And so the lower numbers are the first part of that neighborhood to be developed, and then as things got built up, then additional numbers are added. So unlike street numbers, which necessarily in the United States go from lower to higher, in the case of a Japanese neighborhood, you don't have that advantage. That's why a map with this kind of detail is so important. And why Google Maps really, as much as I love them, just doesn't quite cut it. All right, so now that we've looked at that, I want to do a live demonstration of what Mappion can do for you. This is the main Mappion page, and admittedly, I find it graphically really overwhelming. There's just so much going on here. We have, this little guy flying through telling us that they now offer 3D maps and whatnot. This is a pretty advertisement-heavy web page. It's easy to get distracted, and I certainly can't demonstrate all of the functions of the page for you, but I just wanted to point out a couple things. First of all, notice that that central map here of Japan is broken up by the Chiho, by the regions. So let's say we wanted to look more closely at Kansai. If we put our cursor over Kansai, then it tells us what prefectures that covers. You can search this map by a lot of different methods. You can just get an entire country map. You can search for an address. You can search for a station or a particular transportation line. You can search by zip code. And they have similar choices up here. You can just like you can with Google Maps, get a travel route. You can also get routes that tell you if you're taking public transportation, where you have to change your train and or bus, and or if you were walking, how you would get there, and that kind of thing. So I'm just going to, as an example, zoom in. I'm going to go to Kansai, click on Kansai. When you do that, then it shows you your choices of the different possible cities that you can take a look at. So we have Osaka and Nara, and here they're even giving us the romanization. Let's go to Kyoto. And then we'll scroll down and see that this is the entire municipality. And Kyoto is a pretty big municipality. I just want to look at the city proper, so I'm going to click on the city proper. And then that brings us here. Let's say I want to zoom in, and so the zoom is here, just like you might expect on Google Maps. And as we get closer, we of course see more detail. This is the central shopping district in Kyoto. And it's actually City Hall that it's really zooming in on here. And when we get into real close detail, we see specific businesses that have all been labeled within the city. And the different neighborhood names appear here. As I scroll through, you'll see that some things are given romanization, but for the most part, you have to work with the kanji. I moved a little bit into a different part of the neighborhood, but the other thing I want to show you, well, first I want to comment that in the case of Kyoto, the way that addresses work is a little bit different than what we saw in Osaka, because Kyoto is such an old city, so we don't see the number divisions here as much. But let's say I wanted to know what's the address of this particular place where my cursor is. It tells me when I hover my cursor here that if I do a right-hand click, I'll get more information about that particular area. So if I click on that right-hand side, I get a little bubble, and it tells me the postal address here of that particular place, and gives me more information about where it is, what its distance is from one thing or another. So that's another way. If you find a place on the map and you want to know what the postal address is, you can use Mapion and it will tell you what it is. So although, as I said, it's a little bit visually overwhelming, Mapion is probably the most accurate online map resource for Japan, at least for now. We'll see what comes up in the future. Okay, so I'm going to move away from maps and talk a little bit about place names, or chime. Most places in not just Japan, but all of East Asia are named for the topography. So for example, Beijing means the northern capital, Tokyo means the eastern capital, and Seoul means the capital city. Hunan means that it's south of the lake, Kita Kyushu means it's northern Kyushu, and Yeongnam means that it's south of the peaks. Changchun means it has a long spring. Aomori means that it is a green forest, and Taigu is that it's a big hill. When we see these names in romanization, we don't really appreciate their connection to the landscape, but many of these names really are intimately connected with what we see on the ground. Now, geographical names in Japan can be as difficult to read as people's names, and we've already looked at how hard it is to read a lot of people's names. Even native speakers, when they're traveling reading roadsides, might say to themselves, I wonder how that's pronounced. Some place names are intuitive, maybe even the majority of them are, but others are not. And particularly when you're dealing with older names, it can be a real challenge. Having spent a lot of time in Kyoto, I'll say that probably for me, Kyoto presents the most, Kyoto and its region around it presents some of the biggest challenges for name reading. So I'll give you some examples. I'm going to play a little bit of a game here. Here are some kanji, and it's a place name. It's a very common place name. Now you might just look at it and think, oh, that must be Daiwa. Because, well, that's the onyomi, right? But it isn't. It's read Yamato. This one, likewise, is from central Japan. It's a place that appears often in early works like the Manyoshu. And it's pronounced not Kine, which is what you might guess based on the onyomi, but rather it's pronounced Omi. This one's near and dear to my heart. This is not in central Japan. This is in Kyushu. And you think to yourself, wait, that's daibun. I know daibun. I know that word. I learned it in Japanese class. Yes, in that context it is, but in this context it's the prefecture of Oita. This one's familiar to a lot of folks. A big city in central Japan. It's not Shindo. It's Kobe. And this one, which just makes me feel dyslexic. This one is Tottori. Every time I look at it, I think, no, it should be Tori, Totsu, Totori, but it's Tottori. There it is. Okay, so there's lots of bizarre place names. What can you do to learn to read them? Well, of course, one resource is to use O'Neill's Dictionary, because O'Neill's Dictionary does have a lot of place names. So keep that in mind. I'll be saying a little bit more later on about other bibliographic resources, geographical resources. But before we get there, I also want to let you in on some of the secrets, if you will, of geographical names in Japan. And I'm going to start with aliases. This chart shows us the old province names here in the 7 districts. Here we have the Tokaido and the Hokurikudo here, right? Then on the right-hand side, we have corresponding what I'm going to call aliases. So the proper province name would often be abbreviated by taking either the first or the second kanji in the province name and attaching it to shu, which is often translated as state or province. Okay. So if you go through the list, you'll see that in this case it's taking the second character. In this case, it's taking the first character. In this case, it's also taking the first character. Okay, if we were working in kanji, this is not too hard. If you're a modern Japanese, it does mean that you probably need to be familiar with those old province names. You might think, gee, why would I want to learn those things? Because actually, these aliases live on today. People use these aliases sort of instinctively, particularly for wherever it is that they're living. So they know their home state by that alias. And maybe people from the outside don't, but you should be, if you're going to be visiting, familiar with that reference. So let me give you a specific example of why this is problematic. On the upper right-hand side, I've chosen Harima province. Harima is written with these kanji. Harima. But when we take that kanji, that first one, the hari, and we combine it with shu, we stop using the kunyomi and we start using the onyomi. And for all of these aliases, that is largely the case. So if you see this word, this alias written in romanization, B-A-N-S-H-U, that's not going to help you figure out that it's actually harima. See, if you're a native speaker, you see that first kanji and you can put it together. You think to yourself, okay, that's the hari of harima. That must be what it is. And no problem, right? But for those of us who are working often in romanization, we see banshu and the connection is lost because the kanji have been lost. There's a more complete list of these aliases, at least one that has some romanization on it to help you out in the Princeton Companion. It's on page 427. So if you want to take a quick look at that, maybe you'll be able to start putting some of these things together. I had a student a couple of years ago who took this class, and she had been an exchange student in Japan for a year between high school and college. And I can't remember what area she lived in, but in any event, in that area, they used the alias term all the time. and she heard it and she knew what it meant, but she could never figure out how it ever came, what was the etymology of that word. It just never made any sense to her because first of all, she'd never learned the old province names. And then, of course, you have the switch from kunyomi to onyomi, and that made things very difficult too. And as I was going through this material in the lecture, and I pointed out this change over from the kunyomi to the onyomi, the classical name, into this abbreviation, into this alias, she had been sitting there very quietly the whole time, and suddenly she sat up and she said, "Oh, that's why. I get it now." And she finally put it all together. So there is a current application for this kind of knowledge. So that's secret number one. Let me give you secret number two. That is that the Japanese have a penchant for combining place names. And the same thing happens when they combine place names as we saw with the aliases. And that is that you move from using the kunyomi into the onyomi. And if you're working with kanji, this is not a big deal. But if you're working solely in romanization, it can be a real pain. So, for example, here's 3 common combination place names that if you live in Japan, you'll probably run into. Hanshin, there's a baseball team called the Hanshin Tigers. I know many fans. And Hanshin is the combination of Osaka, the Saka of Osaka, and this kanji, which here is pronounced ko, but it has an onyomi of shin, also, of course, has a kunyomi of kami. So if we take those 2 characters and we smush them together, like we see here, we don't read it sakako, we read it hanshin. Another example, Keihan. It's a Keihan train line. The Keihan train line runs between Kyoto and Osaka. So the kyo stops being pronounced kyo and is now pronounced kei. It's a different onyomi. And in the case of Osaka, we move from the kunyomi to the onyomi. So Kyoto and Osaka together is Keihan. How about Keihin? Well, this kei isn't referring to Kyoto anymore. It's referring to Tokyo. And how about the hin? The hin is the hama of Yokohama. So we see that in romanization, this is simply a headache. And there's no particular formula that would necessarily help you work these things out. The good news is if you look up these combinations in your Nelsons, it will tell you which 2 cities those words refer to. So you're not entirely kind of just left up to your own devices. But you have to be savvy when you hear these words and try and figure out, this is why you want to see the kanji, so that you can function and be more intuitive about these place names. Okay, last but not least, I want to talk about different resources for geography. I already mentioned and reminded you that O'Neill's dictionary has place names in addition to people's names. And as a learner of Japanese as a foreign language, I think that you would be best served by using O'Neill's dictionary in most cases. There are also Japanese resources such as the Konsai Nihonchi Meijiten. We have a copy of this in the SUNY Albany Library. This is a small single volume dictionary, but the big difference here is in a way parallel to the big difference that we saw between O'Neill's and biographical dictionaries. So the Konsai Nihonchi Meijiten will give you information about specific places. It's not just a dictionary that gives you the reading of a name. It tells you, if it's a prefecture, for example, what older names did it used to have in the pre-modern era? What kind of history does it have? What kind of geopolitical history does it have? That kind of thing. Lots and lots of information. So an entry is certainly more than 1 line. In the case of O'Neill's, a place name entry can be just like a person's name entry. It's just 1 quick little line there. There's also such a thing called the Nihon Nekishi Chimei Taikei, which is a much bigger collection, multi-volume dictionary. I wouldn't expect most libraries to have this, but I mention it just so you know that there are some big guns out there, kind of like Motohashi is a big gun for kanji in general. let me say a little bit more about a couple of these. The Konsai Nihonchi Meiji Ten, as I said, is a one-volume dictionary. How is it organized? It's arranged in phonetically ordered entries according to the Goju Onzu. And there is an index in the back arranged by kanji stroke number. So if you have a name and you're not sure how to read it, you don't have your own nails, you can use this dictionary to figure that out. And that kanji stroke number is based on what you should be familiar with in the kanji radical system. Yet one more argument for learning the kanji radical system. And each entry gives you a lot of information about the specific place, its older names, maybe what important events happened there. For example, if there were a battle that happened in that region or something like that. Or let's say you were looking at a place name that's in Hokkaido, it might tell you when was this incorporated within the country, that kind of information. The Zoho Dai Nihon Shimeji Sho is this multi-volume, huge, as I was saying, big gun. It has been a monumental Japanese geographical dictionary based on historical principles since way back when. Now, one of the problems is that it was first published before the war, 1911 to 1913, and then it was revised after the war in 1969 and 1971. And so consequently, it still has some antiquated information. Bullet point 3, I point out that you have to be careful because of its age. It does include territories like Sakhalin, the Northern Islands, and Taiwan, because those were in the early 20th century Japanese territories. So you got to take what it says with a grain of salt in terms of the geopolitical boundaries, but in terms of the detail that it has about place names, famous temples, rivers, mountains, and landmarks, it's really an unbeatable resource. And then underneath each entry, you'll get an incredibly detailed list of material, list of information. Of course, this is all in Japanese, and so I don't really expect undergraduates to be using it a lot, but I want you to tuck knowledge of it back in your brain for the future. It contains lots of indices arranged both in the Ayuwa order and by the stroke count of the first kanji, so that you can look up a name that you don't know how to read, and if you know how to read it, find it that way too. The individual volumes are grouped geographically and according to the pre-modern provinces with cross-references to the modern prefectures. So it's largely rooted in Japanese geographic history, not so much in the modern day. So also notice that the final publication date for that is 1972. And since 1972, the geopolitical borders really haven't changed, but time does march on. And so you have to keep that in mind also as you're using it. So those are the major resources in geography and some of the tricks of the trade within geography. We've got one more learning module left, and that's philosophical resources.